Cruises are supposed to be the easy version of travel. Nice view, decent food, and the comforting lie that nothing can go horribly wrong on a giant floating hotel. History naturally ruined that idea. These are 33 of the worst cruises ever, where pleasure trips turned into fires, collisions, storms, panic, and some truly world-class human stupidity. 1. In 1851, the yacht Janet set out near Wolf Island for what should have been a cheerful regatta trip. The kind of outing where people expect wind in the sails and bragging rights at dinner, not a sudden appointment with disaster. Instead, a violent squall hit, the vessel capsized, and 19 people were killed. That is the ugly thing about many early pleasure voyages. They were sold as elegant fun, but weather on open water did not care about your social plans. One minute, it is a festive race day mood. The next minute, Lake Ontario is flipping your boat like it is clearing a table. Janet became an early reminder that recreational sailing in the 19th century could go from glamorous to catastrophic with almost insulting speed. 2. The Lady Elgin disaster in 1860 feels like the kind of story a screenwriter would be told to tone down for being too cruelly efficient. After a political excursion from Chicago, the night steamer was crossing Lake Michigan during rough weather when it was rammed by the schooner Augusta. Not brushed, not nudged, properly smashed. The Lady Elgin was mortally damaged and broke apart, and around 300 people died. A trip that had started with speeches, fellowship, and festive energy ended in black water, wreckage, and desperate survival attempts in a storm. It also became one of the most infamous Great Lakes disasters of the century because it captured a grim truth. On busy waterways, pleasure steamers were not just at the mercy of weather, but also of traffic, darkness, human judgment, and terrible timing. 3. Princess Alice in 1878 was supposed to deliver one of those charming Thames Moonlight excursions that sound almost aggressively wholesome. People boarded expecting music, scenery, cool evening air, and the cozy illusion that Victorian leisure was organized and civilized. Then the excursion steamer collided with the Bywell Castle, split apart, and sank so quickly that hundreds were trapped in chaos. Somewhere between 600 and 700 people died, making it one of the worst inland waterway disasters in British history. And just to make the whole thing even more horrifying, the ship went down in a filthy stretch of the Thames loaded with sewage and industrial waste. So the elegant moonlight trip became a nightmare of darkness, impact, panic, and poisoned water. Victorian leisure apparently came with shockingly bad refund policies. 4. In 1890, the Sea Wing was carrying excursion passengers on Lake Pepin, which probably sounded like a delightful day out because the name itself feels gentle and harmless. Then a sudden squall came through and proved once again that calm-looking water can turn into a murderer in minutes. The boat capsized and 98 passengers drowned. A lot of 19th century excursion tragedies follow this exact brutal pattern. Overloaded optimism, weak preparation, one savage weather shift, and then disaster faster than anybody can process it. Sea Wing became one of the deadliest examples on inland American waters, and it stuck in public memory precisely because the trip felt so ordinary. Nobody boards a scenic excursion thinking they are starring in a cautionary tale about wind dynamics, vessel stability, and nature's absolute refusal to care about your picnic schedule. 5. Surf City in 1898 was a small excursion steamer operating near Beverly, Massachusetts, and like many little pleasure boats of the era, it offered that cozy local trip confidence that makes people assume everything is under control. Then a sudden squall hit, the vessel overturned, and the outing collapsed into catastrophe. Several passengers were killed, and the trip became a harsh lesson in how quickly small excursion steamers could become death traps when weather turned nasty. That is the recurring nightmare with these vessels. They often looked friendly, approachable, almost domestic, like floating extensions of a summer afternoon. But once a squall slammed into them, all that charm meant very little. Surf City was not a giant liner with dramatic headlines from across the world. It was worse in a different way. It showed how ordinary local fun could be broken in seconds. 6. The yacht Idler went out on Lake Erie in 1900 for a luxury pleasure cruise, which sounds like the sort of trip designed for polished shoes, fancy conversation, and people pretending not to judge each other's hats. Instead, a storm hit, the vessel sank, and only a handful from the passenger party survived. That contrast is what makes the story land so hard. Luxury sells control. It sells the idea that money has purchased a buffer against chaos. Lake Erie, naturally, did not read the brochure. The Idler disaster showed that private yachts and upscale pleasure cruises were just as vulnerable as humbler excursion craft when weather and seamanship went bad at the same time. A refined outing on the water turned into the kind of survival scene usually reserved for people who made much worse life choices. 7. Bon Voyage had one job in 1901: carry passengers safely between Ontonagon and Hancock. Instead, the passenger steamer caught fire, had to be beached, and burned so badly that the vessel was nearly destroyed. 4 passengers died, which may sound smaller than some of the giant body count disasters on this list. But shipboard fire is terrifying in a way that numbers alone do not fully capture. Fire at sea is the ultimate betrayal. Water is everywhere, and yet somehow it is the one place where flames can still corner you. Bon Voyage also had the kind of name history loves to punish. Calling a vessel Bon Voyage and then having it turn into a floating furnace feels less like irony and more like a personal insult from fate. Maritime history has a very dark sense of humor. 8. General Slocum in 1904 was not just a bad cruise. It was one of the worst excursion disasters in American history, and one of the most horrifying urban maritime tragedies ever. The steamer was carrying a church group from New York on a picnic outing when fire broke out on board. What followed was a complete systems failure dressed up as a holiday. Life preservers were rotten, safety gear was useless, panic spread, and more than 1,000 people died, many of them women and children. It was not simply bad luck. It was negligence with a smokestack. The whole disaster exposed how fake safety could be when inspections, maintenance, and management were basically theater. A church picnic became a floating inferno, and the General Slocum turned from a cheerful excursion boat into a symbol of what happens when corners are cut for too long. 9. Prinzessin Victoria Luise was the world's first purpose-built cruise ship, which means it was practically the luxury cruise industry's proud origin story. Beautiful vessel, elegant Caribbean itineraries, rich passengers, premium atmosphere, the full package. Then in 1906, it ran onto a reef near Jamaica because of a navigation mistake and was lost. That alone would be a brutal debut chapter for cruise history. But the story gets darker. Its captain, devastated by the wreck, later took his own life. So one of the first great symbols of leisure cruising did not just suffer a mishap. It went down in scandal, tragedy, and humiliation. There is something almost poetic about the first dedicated cruise ship proving, right at the start, that even the most polished luxury concept is still fundamentally a giant object trying not to lose an argument with geography. 10. The JS in 1910 was the first purpose-built excursion steamer for the Mississippi, which sounds like a proud piece of river tourism ambition. Someone basically said, "Let us create a vessel specifically designed for fun on this legendary river." The river answered with fire. During a cruise near La Crosse, the JS burned, with hundreds of people on board, and the vessel was lost. It is hard to imagine a more efficient way to ruin a launch-era success story. A ship built to symbolize modern excursion, comfort ended up proving how thin that comfort could be when flames broke out on a crowded wooden passenger vessel. And once again, the same pattern appears. Confidence in engineering, heavy public excitement, then sudden chaos and desperate evacuation. Early cruise culture loved elegance. Maritime reality kept handing it smoke, panic, and a very expensive lesson. 11. Silver Spray ran aground on Morgan Shoal near Chicago in 1914 while passengers were disembarking, which already sounds like the sort of awkward maritime problem that should end in embarrassment and angry complaints, not full destruction. But rescue and salvage efforts failed. The wooden excursion steamer eventually capsized, and the vessel was destroyed. It is one of those disasters that feels less like a single cinematic explosion and more like a slow-motion public unraveling. People saw the danger develop in stages, which somehow makes it even more painful. Silver spray represented the fragility of excursion shipping on the Great Lakes, especially when a vessel got into trouble near shore, and everyone assumed that meant the worst was over. Not necessarily. Maritime history loves proving that being close to safety is not the same thing as actually reaching it. 12. Eastland in 1915 barely even managed the cruise part before turning into catastrophe. The ship was tied up in the Chicago River, preparing for an employee outing, when it rolled over at the dock and killed 844 people. At the dock. That detail alone makes the whole thing feel unreal. This was supposed to be a company excursion, a day of leisure before the vessel had even properly started its journey. Instead, passengers were trapped in a sudden capsize in shallow water, which sounds impossible until you remember that ship stability can be a deeply unforgiving science. Eastland had design problems, loading problems, and a fatal vulnerability that turned a routine boarding process into mass death. It remains one of the most grotesquely absurd maritime disasters ever, because a pleasure trip managed to become lethal before it had even left the parking space. 13. Christopher Columbus was one of the grand excursion liners of the Great Lakes, the kind of vessel that made leisure travel feel big, modern, and vaguely majestic. Then in 1917, it collided with a water crib off Milwaukee, a structure that sounds boring until a ship hits it and proves otherwise. Passengers died, panic followed, and a glamorous excursion turned into one of the region's most notorious local maritime disasters. The strange thing about this one is that it was not some wild ocean storm or distant tropical reef. It was a major pleasure vessel wrecked in familiar home waters near a major city, which made the whole event feel even more unsettling. People like to imagine catastrophe happening far away, somewhere exotic and dramatic. Christopher Columbus reminded everyone that you could board for a nice local outing and still end up in a very bad chapter of history. 14. In 1918, the paddle steamer Columbia sank on the Illinois River during an excursion, killing 87 people and dealing a near-fatal blow to the big excursion trade on that river. That last part matters, because some disasters do more than kill. They destroy public trust so completely that an entire business model starts wobbling. Columbia was one of those. River excursion culture relied on selling people a mood, music, scenery, sociability, and just enough mechanical grandeur to make a local trip feel special. When Columbia went down, that mood was replaced by a very different public image: overcrowding, danger, and the ugly possibility that a cheerful paddle wheel outing could end at the bottom of the river. It is hard to market nostalgia and river romance when the newspapers are busy describing bodies, wreckage, and a sinking that everybody thought should have been avoidable. 15. Nestor in 1921 managed to turn a pleasure cruise on the Hopkins River into a disaster in almost record time. The motor launch sank only minutes after departure, and 10 people died. There is something especially cruel about accidents that happen so fast the outing barely has time to become an outing. People are still settling in, still exchanging early trip comments, still mentally in the safe zone, and suddenly the entire scene collapses into cold water, shock, and frantic survival. Nestor shows that you do not need a giant liner, a famous ocean route, or a violent all-night storm to create a historic maritime tragedy. Sometimes all it takes is a small vessel, a few terrible minutes, and the awful realization that the line between local recreation and disaster is much thinner than anyone wanted to believe. 16. The Mackinac disaster in 1925 took a day cruise from Pawtucket to Newport and detonated it with one of the least welcome phrases in transport history: boiler explosion. Dozens of excursionists were killed when the vessel's machinery turned the trip into a nightmare. Boiler failures had haunted steam travel for generations, but they remained especially cruel on pleasure vessels because the passengers were not crossing oceans out of necessity. They were there for fun. That makes the violence of the event hit even harder. People boarded expecting sea air and a nice coastal outing. Instead, they got the terrifying reminder that steam-era leisure still rested on industrial hardware that could go from useful to murderous in an instant. Nothing destroys the illusion of civilized travel, quite like the engine deciding it would rather become a bomb. 17. Favorite in 1927 was a small Chicago excursion boat, And like many small outing craft, it probably inspired exactly the kind of relaxed confidence that gets people into trouble. It looked manageable, local, harmless. Then a sudden squall hit on Lake Michigan, the boat capsized, and 27 people died, many of them children. That is where the tone has to shift, because the absurdity here is not in the victims or even in the weather. It is in how often this exact lesson had already been taught by then. Sudden weather on large lakes was not a surprise by the late 1920s. Yet small passenger excursions still kept ending in chaos because optimism, economics, and weak safeguards make a very dangerous cocktail. Favorite became another heartbreaking example of a family-style outing shattered by water that turned violent faster than anyone on board could react. 18. Fort Victoria left New York in 1929 on a holiday cruise to Bermuda, which is exactly the kind of sentence that should continue with tropical cocktails, deck chairs, and people writing smug postcards home. Instead, in thick fog in Ambrose Channel, the ship collided with another vessel and sank the same day. Imagine paying for a sunny island escape and not even making it properly out of the departure zone before maritime reality punches you in the face. That is part of what makes Fort Victoria such a memorable failure. It was not wrecked in some distant cyclone after weeks of drama. It got wrecked almost right off the front step in one of the busiest approaches to New York, proving that luxury cruising could fall apart before the vacation had even established a decent rhythm. Paradise brochure. Meet harbor traffic. 19. Eureka. 2 was a glass-bottom excursion boat in Miami, which sounds like one of the most aggressively touristy and cheerful concepts imaginable. The whole point is literally to look at pretty things under the water while remaining comfortably above it. In 1930, after returning from a sightseeing trip, the vessel exploded and sank. Most people were saved, but several died, which means even this bright little novelty cruise found a way to become a maritime horror story. That contrast is almost absurd. A glass-bottom boat sells transparency, safety, and harmless wonder. Then suddenly there is an explosion, panic, and the boat itself joining the underwater scenery. Eureka. 2 belongs on this list because it captures a special kind of vacation betrayal. People signed up to admire the sea. They did not expect the vessel to become part of the problem. 20. Bermuda in 1931 was a luxury holiday liner on the Bermuda service, which in theory meant polished public rooms, stylish passengers, and the full floating resort fantasy. Then a massive fire tore through the ship in Hamilton Harbor and gutted the passenger decks. Even when everybody does not die, a disaster can still be spectacularly cruise-ruining, and Bermuda is a perfect example. A liner built to deliver tropical elegance was reduced to a charred, wrecked interior, basically a grand hotel transformed into a burnt shell. Shipboard fires were especially terrifying because they attacked the very spaces passengers trusted most: the lounges, cabins, promenades, all the places designed to feel safe and civilized. Once those start burning, the whole illusion collapses. Bermuda was supposed to sell luxury escape. Instead, it became a floating demonstration of how quickly glamour can smell like smoke. 21. Bywell Castle in 1934 is one of those disasters so infamous it almost feels mythic, except the horror was completely real. The liner was on a pleasure run between Havana and New York when fire broke out at sea. What followed was chaos on a spectacular scale. Flames spreading through the ship, failures in leadership, passengers trapped in confusion, and 137 deaths before the burning vessel drifted ashore near New Jersey like some kind of nightmare ghost. The imagery alone is unforgettable. A blazing cruise liner appearing off the American coast at dawn looked less like transport failure and more like history trying to stage its own horror film. Bywell Castle became notorious, not just because of the death toll, but because it exposed how badly things could go when fire, panic, and command breakdown combined. Luxury travel turned into televised dread. 22. St. George in 1935 was an excursion launch near St. Lucia, not a giant ocean liner with endless decks and ballroom myths, just a smaller pleasure craft doing what countless local passenger boats did all over the Caribbean. Then it capsized and sank, killing 41 people. That smaller scale is exactly why it belongs here. Maritime history is full of famous luxury wrecks, but many of the deadliest leisure voyage tragedies happened on modest regional boats, where safety margins were thin and rescue could become chaos very quickly. For the people on board, it made no difference whether the brochure was glamorous or simple. The trip still ended in disaster. St. George is a reminder that bad cruises are not only the giant cinematic ones. Sometimes they are local, sudden, and terrifyingly direct, with no grand legend, just loss. 23. Hamonic in 1945 suffered a catastrophic fire in Sarnia and was completely lost, which is a brutal end for a Great Lakes passenger vessel that had once represented a stylish era of regional cruising. By the mid-20th century, people like to imagine that modern passenger shipping had outgrown the most ridiculous old disasters. Better systems, better construction, more experience, surely we had learned something by then. Hamonic answered with smoke and total destruction. Even though the fire happened in port, that does not make it less dramatic. In some ways, it makes it more humiliating. A vessel that survived years of service ended up dying in a blaze where control should have been strongest. It was another reminder that passenger ships did not need storms or enemy action to be finished off. Sometimes all they needed was fire and a few failures in the wrong order. 24. Noronic in 1949 turned a 7-day Lake Ontario pleasure cruise into one of North America's most infamous passenger ship fires. While the ship was docked in Toronto, fire broke out and spread with horrifying speed through the wooden interior. At least 118 people died. Again, the insult is in the setting. This was not a mid-ocean storm with no hope of help. The ship was in port, close to a major city, and still the blaze tore through it so violently that many passengers had no real chance. The Noronic disaster exposed outdated construction, weak alarm response, and the lethal danger of treating a passenger vessel like a floating nostalgia palace while forgetting that nostalgia burns extremely well. It was a luxury cruise sold on comfort and classic atmosphere. Unfortunately, one of the classic features was apparently the ability to become a furnace at terrifying speed. 25. Bluebell in 1961 may be the strangest entry on this list because it was not simply a cruise disaster. It became a full horror story. During a private Caribbean pleasure voyage, the yacht's captain murdered members of the party and then tried to cover the crime by sinking the vessel. One child survived after drifting alone, which sounds less like normal maritime history and more like somebody accidentally dropped true crime into a luxury charter brochure. What makes Bluebell so chilling is that the usual cruise fears, storm, fire, collision, mechanical failure, are completely bypassed. The danger was not the sea. The danger was the man in command. On a list full of vessels defeated by weather, design, or accident, Bluebell stands out as the moment a pleasure cruise went wrong in the most human, deliberate, and deeply disturbing way possible. 26. Bianca C in 1961 was a passenger pleasure vessel operating in the Caribbean when an engine room explosion triggered a serious fire near Grenada. The ship had to be abandoned and later sank, becoming one of the region's most famous passenger vessel losses. This is the kind of cruise disaster that perfectly shreds the relaxed tropical fantasy. Caribbean cruises are marketed as controlled paradise. Warm water, elegant decks, civilized escape. Then the machinery below turns violent, the ship catches fire, and suddenly your postcard island route is a full emergency evacuation. Bianca C also became visually memorable because the burning liner drifted off Grenada before sinking, which gave the whole event a cinematic quality history did not need. It is a strong entry for this topic because it combines the luxury cruise image with the ancient maritime truth that engine rooms are basically where serenity goes to die. 27. Laconia in 1963 was running a Christmas cruise to the Canary Islands from Southampton, which should have been one of the most easy-to-sell holiday products imaginable. Festive season, ocean liner glamour, winter escape, everybody pretending life is beautifully organized. Then fire broke out at sea, evacuation descended into chaos, and 128 people died. The details are especially ugly because the disaster exposed confusion, poor emergency handling, and a lifeboat response that was nowhere near good enough for the scale of the emergency. A Christmas cruise becoming a flaming survival crisis already feels cruel. The fact that many passengers were elderly only deepens the tragedy. Laconia is one of those cases where the luxury setting makes the collapse feel even harsher. The polished world of formal dining and holiday refinement suddenly gave way to darkness, smoke, panic, and a truly miserable exit. 28. Yarmouth Castle in 1965 was sailing from Miami to Nassau, a route practically built from sunshine and tourism marketing, when fire broke out and the cruise collapsed into catastrophe. The ship burned, later sank, and 90 people died. Beyond the immediate horror, this one mattered because it helped force tougher safety rules for passenger vessels. In other words, the disaster was bad enough that regulators finally had to stop pretending old standards were good enough. That is a grimly common pattern in transport history. Tragedy shows up first, reform arrives later, and everyone acts shocked that fire on an aging passenger ship turned out to be a serious problem. Yarmouth Castle was not just a terrible cruise. It was a brutal indictment of complacency. The voyage sold escape to the Bahamas. What it delivered instead was smoke, panic, and a legislative wake-up call. 29. Fulvia in 1970 did not become infamous for a mass death toll, but it absolutely earned its place among the worst cruises because the ship basically self-destructed as a holiday experience. Near Tenerife, an engine room explosion caused a fire. The situation spiraled beyond recovery, everyone had to get off, and the vessel later sank while under tow. So yes, the passengers and crew were saved, but the cruise still ended with that uniquely expensive and embarrassing outcome where your floating resort turns into a write-off. Fulvia shows that by the modern cruise era, the core formula of maritime humiliation remained alive and well. It did not matter that ships looked sleeker and the industry sounded more polished. Put explosive machinery under a pleasure liner, then add open water and bad luck, and modernity starts looking suspiciously like the old days with better brochures. 30. Niagara Belle in 1970 managed to create one of the most nightmare-inducing tourist scenarios imaginable without becoming a mass fatality disaster. The cruise boat ran aground in the Niagara River only a few miles from Niagara Falls. Everybody survived, but psychologically this is elite-level bad cruise material, because when a tourist boat gets stuck near one of the world's most famous waterfalls, every passenger instantly becomes aware of the geography in a way nobody enjoys. It is the pure terror of proximity. You are not over the falls, but you are near enough for the brain to start writing terrible possibilities all by itself. Rescue eventually succeeded, but the story stuck because it turned a routine sightseeing trip into a suspended panic session beside one of nature's most aggressively non-negotiable landmarks. Great views, awful vibes. 31. Antilles in 1971 was a French cruise ship operating in the West Indies when it struck a reef near Moustique, caught fire, and was lost. This is almost a perfect summary of how cruise dreams fail in layers. First, the navigational embarrassment of hitting the reef, then the fire arrives to make sure the whole event cannot stay merely inconvenient. Reef groundings are especially humiliating because they feel like the ocean pointing at a map and saying, "You had one obvious thing not to hit." Antilles had the classic pleasure cruise setting, warm water, island route, holiday mood, and then ran directly into one of the oldest maritime enemies in the book. Even without a giant death toll, it belongs on this list because total loss of ship on a leisure voyage is peak bad cruise energy. Paradise turned into a salvage problem. 32. Canberra in 1973 was a famous cruise liner, widely admired, highly visible, and exactly the kind of ship that represented confidence in modern passenger travel. Then, during a cruise voyage, it ran aground near St. Thomas. No, it was not the deadliest disaster here. Yes, it still absolutely fits. Because part of the point of worst cruises is not only body count, it is also spectacular failure of the basic assignment. A luxury liner is supposed to glide elegantly through tropical waters, not wedge itself where it clearly should not be. Groundings on big cruise ships have a special kind of public embarrassment to them. They make these enormous, expensive symbols of control look clumsy and strangely mortal. Canberra's incident worked as a modern reminder that even prestigious liners could still lose an argument with navigation and geography in front of everybody. 33. Baltica in 1973 is a perfect final example because by that point the cruise industry had decades of disasters behind it and still managed to produce another luxury voyage grounding near Bermuda. This was the modern era. Bigger ships, more experience, supposedly better systems, and yet here we are again with a cruise liner stuck where it should not be. That is what makes Baltica such a fitting closer for the list. It captures the stubborn continuity of cruise chaos. Across a century of pleasure travel, the decor changes, the brochures improve, the passengers dress differently, but the core risks remain weirdly loyal. Bad judgment, bad conditions, bad luck, and the ocean waiting patiently for another expensive mistake. Even when nobody dies, a cruise that ends with your shiny liner grounded off Bermuda has officially failed the relaxation test in the most public way possible. So which one was the absolute worst? The most terrifying, the most avoidable, or the most unbelievably stupid? And more importantly, which disaster did we leave out that absolutely deserved a place on this list? Go argue in the comments, then hit like, subscribe, and stick around for more history at its weirdest, dumbest, and most catastrophic.